Tudor England saw many deaths, but the execution of Henry Howard remains a messy stain because it was just so senseless. A poet with a free spirit was beheaded simply because some drawings on a family crest were seen as treason by an aging, paranoid King Henry VIII. His death at 30 is a cold reminder that even a high status can be wiped out by one unfair decree. However, if you only feel sorry for Howard, just remember his legacy. Alongside Sir Thomas Wyatt, he was the literary pioneer who gave English literature its modern backbone. He was the one who refined the English sonnet, creating the blueprint for the style that Shakespeare would later perfect to capture hearts across the globe. Even as an arrogant noble often caught in trouble, he still managed to leave a lasting personal mark through his writing, ensuring his name carries value long after his messy end under the axe. The England into which Henry Howard was born was a nation undergoing a spiritual turmoil, ruled by a king who had transformed from a golden Renaissance prince into a sickly, tyrannical shadow of his former self. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was vast and physically rotting, suffering from ulcerated legs that oozed foul fluid and caused him constant grinding agony. This pain twisted his personality, turning him into a paranoid, vicious tyrant with a hair-trigger temper. This physical decay mirrored the spiritual violence he had unleashed upon his people. In his desperate quest for an heir, Henry had torn England away from the Catholic Church, smashing 1,000 years of tradition. This was not a clean break. It was a tearing of the nation's soul that turned the royal court into a battlefield of intrigue, divided into two distinct warring tribes. On one side stood the old nobility, the feudal leviathans led by the Howard family. They were religious conservatives who believed power was a birthright transmitted through blood and soil. They viewed themselves as the natural advisors to the crown and looked upon the king's new secretaries with sheer contempt, seeing them as grasping, low-born parasites. Opposing them were the new men, ambitious lawyers and minor gentry like the Seymour family, who had risen through merit and Protestant zeal. They believed in a centralized state where power came from competence, not a famous grandfather. To them, the old nobility were dangerous relics of a forgotten age, traitors who cared more for their family crest than the safety of the realm. Henry VIII, in his cunning and madness, played these two groups against each other to maintain control. He used the new men to break the church and the old nobility to provide legitimacy, keeping everyone in a state of perpetual terror. He would raise one faction up only to crush it the moment it grew too powerful. It was into this toxic, high-stakes environment that Henry Howard was born. He was not just a member of the old nobility, he was its prince, standing at the very summit of the social mountain. From his earliest breath, he was taught two dangerous things: that he was better than everyone else, and that the new men were his natural mortal enemies. Henry Howard's story begins with his blood. To the modern mind, genealogy is a hobby. To the Tudor mind, it was destiny, it was political currency, and it was a death sentence. He was born around 1517, most likely at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire. He was the eldest son of Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk. The Howards were the rough, tough fighting dogs of the English aristocracy. They were not soft courtiers, they were warlords. His grandfather, the second Duke, was the hero of the Battle of Flodden, the man who had crushed the Scots and killed the Scottish King James IV in 1513. But it was his mother's side that carried the dangerous magic. His mother was Lady Elizabeth Stafford, the daughter of Edward Stafford, the third Duke of Buckingham. This connection is the key to decoding Henry Howard's psychology. The Duke of Buckingham had been the greatest nobleman in England, a man so wealthy and so royal that he had his own court that rivaled the king's. Buckingham had Plantagenet blood. He was a descendant of King Edward III. The Tudors, we must remember, were usurpers. Henry VII had seized the throne by conquest. They were always deeply insecure about their legitimacy. They looked at the old Plantagenet families, the families who had ruled England for centuries, with paranoid suspicion. They called them the White Roses, remnants of the House of York. In 1521, when Henry Howard was just a small child of 4 years old, King Henry VIII decided that the Duke of Buckingham was too tall a poppy. On flimsy charges of treason, he had Buckingham arrested and beheaded on Tower Hill. Consider the impact of this on the young Henry Howard. His grandfather, a man of immense dignity and royal blood, was butchered by the king. The lesson was stark. Royal blood is dangerous. The king fears us. But instead of cowering, the Howard family reacted with a fierce defensive pride. Young Henry Howard grew up with a chip on his shoulder the size of a castle. He was constantly reminded that through his mother he was a descendant of kings. He had the blood of Edward I and Edward III in his veins. In his own mind, his lineage was purer, older, and more English than the Tudors themselves. The third Duke of Norfolk, Henry's father, was a cold, pragmatic survivalist. He was a man who would do anything to stay in power. He was physically brave but morally flexible. A man who would eventually preside over the trials of his own nieces, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, to save his own skin. But Henry Howard, the son, was different. He lacked his father's cold pragmatism. He inherited the arrogance of the Staffords and the martial aggression of the Howards, but he lacked the instinct for caution. He was raised to be a Renaissance man in the truest sense. The Duke of Norfolk spared no expense on his heir's education. Tutors were brought in to drill the boy in the classics. He didn't just learn to read Latin, he learned to think in it. He absorbed the stoicism of Seneca and the epic glory of Virgil. He learned French, Spanish, and Italian. He was taught to ride, to hunt, to handle a lance, and to dance the complex steps of court masks. By the time he was a teenager, Henry Howard was a masterpiece of aristocratic engineering. He was brilliant, articulate, physically robust, and cultured. He was the perfect courtier. But there was a flaw in the diamond. He was also profoundly snobbish. He had absorbed the idea that the old nobility were the only people who mattered. He looked at the rising new men, the Seymours, the Cromwells, the riches-obsessed lawyers. And he didn't just see political rivals. He saw a virus. He saw dirt. He believed that their presence in the king's council chamber was an insult to the natural order of the universe. This was not a quiet prejudice. Henry Howard was incapable of being quiet about anything. He was a man who spoke his mind with a dangerous lack of filter. He walked through the corridors of power with his nose in the air, sneering at men who held the king's ear. In the 1520s, this was merely the petulance of a spoiled boy. But as the 1530s dawned, and the Reformation began to tear the country apart, this attitude would transform from a character flaw into a political weapon that his enemies would use to destroy him. To understand the tragedy of his end, however, we must first witness the brilliance of his beginning. Before the shadows of the tower lengthened across his life, there was a season where the sun seemed to shine exclusively for him. The darkness of his family's past and the uncertainty of the future were momentarily suspended when the king made a decision that would lift the young Henry Howard out of the grim lessons of history and place him into a living fairy tale. The white lion was about to leave the den and enter a world of princes. If the scaffold on Tower Hill was the dark finale of Henry Howard's life, the years at Windsor Castle were the brilliant, blinding overture. In 1529, the 12-year-old Henry Howard was summoned by the king to fulfill a role that was both an honor and a burden. He was to become the companion, bedfellow, and brother to Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond. Fitzroy was a unique figure in Tudor history. He was King Henry VIII's illegitimate son by his mistress, Bessie Blount. In a world desperate for a male heir, the king doted on this boy with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Fitzroy was handsome, athletic, and intelligent, everything the king saw in himself. He was heaped with titles: Duke of Richmond, Duke of Somerset, Earl of Nottingham, Lord High Admiral. He was a prince in everything but name. When Henry Howard arrived at Windsor to join Fitzroy's household, he wasn't just entering a schoolroom, he was entering a brotherhood. The two boys were almost the same age. Fitzroy was just a few months younger. They were mirrored souls, both high-born, both burdened with the weight of great names, both expected to lead the next generation of England. For the next 3 years, they lived a life of idyllic privilege that Surrey would later immortalize as his golden days. Windsor Castle in the 1530s was not merely a fortress, it was a theater of chivalry. The boys were surrounded by the iconography of the Order of the Garter. They lived in a world of heraldry, honor, and martial virtue. Their days were a structured paradise of aristocratic training. They hunted stags in the great parks, their hawks soaring over the Thames Valley. They practiced with swords and lances in the tilt yard, learning the brutal ballet of the joust. They played tennis in the king's courts, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. But it was not all physical. Under the guidance of their tutors, they delved into the intellectual treasures of the Renaissance. They read the ancients, debated philosophy, and most importantly, they fell in love with poetry. It is impossible to overstate the depth of the bond between Surrey and Fitzroy. In the 16th century, male friendship was often expressed in terms of intense emotional intimacy that modern readers might misinterpret. They slept in the same bed, a common practice for warmth and security, but also a sign of absolute trust. They ate from the same plates and they shared their deepest secrets. Surrey didn't just see Fitzroy as a royal charge, he loved him. Fitzroy was the brother Surrey's own nature craved, an equal who could match him in wit, in riding, and in dreams of glory. In these years, the darkness of the Tudor court seemed far away. The executions, the divorces, the religious schisms, these were distant thunders. Inside the walls of Windsor, it was just two young lions at play, blissfully unaware that the cage was slowly closing around them. The bubble of childhood began to expand into the wider world in 1532. King Henry VIII was planning a magnificent summit with his brother monarch, King Francis I of France. This was to be a display of power and prestige designed to shore up French support for Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon and his impending marriage to Anne Boleyn. To showcase the future of England, Henry took the two young dukes, Richmond and Surrey, across the narrow sea to Calais. For the 15-year-old Surrey, the trip to France was a revelation. England, for all its pomp, was still culturally somewhat on the periphery of the Renaissance. France, under Francis I, was its beating heart. The French court was a dazzling spectacle of art, sensuality, and sophistication. Leonardo da Vinci had died in the arms of the French king only a decade earlier. The chateaux of the Loire Valley were being built in the new classical style. While the kings discussed treaties and marriages, Surrey and Fitzroy were given a singular honor. When Henry VIII returned to England, he left the two boys behind at the French court. They were to live with the Dauphin and the French king's other sons as honored guests for nearly a year. This was the crucible that forged Henry Howard the poet. Living in the retinue of the French princes, Surrey was immersed in a culture where a nobleman was expected to be a warrior poet. He was exposed to the works of the great Italian masters, Petrarch, Dante, Ariosto. He heard the French court poets reciting sonnets of courtly love, exploring themes of unrequited passion, the fleeting nature of beauty, and the cruelty of fortune. He realized that the English language, in its current state, was clunky compared to the fluid elegance of French and Italian. He saw that English poetry was still stuck in the rhythms of Chaucer, brilliant but archaic. Surrey began to experiment. He began to translate. He began to wonder if the guttural, heavy English tongue could be tamed to sing like an Italian lute. It was here, amidst the chateaux and the vineyards of France, that the Surrey sonnet began to take shape in his mind. He was taking the raw materials of his own language and smelting them in the fire of the continental Renaissance. But amidst the poetry, the political web was tightening. In 1533, the boys were recalled to England. The world had changed in their absence. Henry VIII had married Anne Boleyn. The break with Rome was final. And Surrey, now 16, was a married man. Before leaving for France, a marriage had been arranged for him with Lady Frances de Vere, the daughter of the Earl of Oxford. It was a classic aristocratic alliance, forged to unite two great houses. She was young, he was young, and initially they lived apart. It was a duty, not a passion. His passion was reserved for his art, his pride, and his brother Fitzroy. To cement the bond between the families even further, the king arranged for Henry Fitzroy to marry Surrey's sister, Mary Howard. The two best friends were now brothers-in-law. The Howard family had pulled off a masterstroke. Their daughter was married to the king's son. If Henry VIII failed to produce a legitimate male heir with Anne Boleyn, it was entirely possible that Fitzroy would be legitimized and named heir to the throne. The Howards were soaring. They were the family of the Queen. Anne Boleyn was a Howard niece. And the family of the king's son. They were untouchable, or so they thought. History rarely provides a single year that acts as a hinge for an entire era. But 1536 was such a year. It was the annus horribilis of the Tudor dynasty, and for Henry Howard, it was the year the golden dream turned into a nightmare. It began with the fall of his cousin, Queen Anne Boleyn. The Howards, despite being Anne's family, were ruthless pragmatists. When Anne failed to give the king a son, and his eye wandered to Jane Seymour, the Howards did not rush to save their kinswoman. They abandoned her. Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, actually presided over the trial of his own niece, condemning her to death with tears of crocodile grief or perhaps genuine shame running down his face. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. Surrey, at 19 years old, lived through the brutal reality of his cousin's execution. It was a stark lesson in the fragility of royal favor. Being a Howard didn't save you. It just made the target on your back larger. But the true blow, the one that would shatter Surrey's heart, was yet to come. In the summer of 1536, shortly after the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry Fitzroy fell ill. The illness was rapid and consuming, likely tuberculosis, the consumption that stalked the Tudor halls. On July 22, 1536, at St. James's Palace, Henry Fitzroy died. He was only 17 years old. The king was devastated, but his grief was soon overshadowed by political inconvenience. He didn't want a grand funeral that would remind the country of his failure to provide a legitimate heir. He ordered the Duke of Norfolk, Surrey's father, to bury the boy quietly, almost secretly. For Surrey, this was a catastrophe. He had lost his best friend, his brother-in-law, his childhood companion. The golden days were officially dead. The dream of a Howard Fitzroy dynasty that would rule England was dust. The trauma of this loss unlocked the floodgates of his genius. In his grief, Surrey wrote one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking poems in the English language. He looked back at Windsor Castle, once the site of their joy, now a painful reminder of what was gone. He wrote, "So cruel prison, how could be tied, alas, as proud Windsor, where I in lust and joy with a king's son my childish years did pass." In this poem, he recounts their memories, the tennis courts, the dances, the stag hunts, the quiet talks late at night. And he ends with a lament that captures the universal agony of grief. And with this thought the blood in the breast doth fry, for greater grief remaineth none within, than where to see the did succeed to bewail the thing. Fitzroy's death changed Surrey. The boy who had played in the sun was gone. In his place stood a young man who was hardening. The joy of his youth calcified into a brittle, dangerous pride. He began to feel that the world was wrong, that fate had cheated him. He looked around the court of the new queen, Jane Seymour, and saw the rise of the new men, her brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour. He saw them stepping into the vacuum left by the Howards. He saw them enjoying the king's favor, and he hated them. He hated them with the burning, irrational intensity of a man who has lost everything he loved and is looking for someone to blame. He viewed the Seymours as upstarts, grasping vultures who were unworthy to untie the shoes of a Howard. The years following Fitzroy's death saw the emergence of the paradoxical Henry Howard, the thug and the aesthete. On one hand, he was the supreme courtier. He dressed in the height of fashion, introducing new cuts and fabrics from the continent. He built a magnificent house, Mount Surrey near Norwich, designed in the purely classical style, the first of its kind in England. He was a patron of painters and musicians. He continued to write his revolutionary poetry, circulating his sonnets in handwritten manuscripts that were devoured by the elite. He was translating Virgil's Aeneid, inventing blank verse to capture the heroic thunder of the Roman epic. But on the other hand, he was a menace. His temper became legendary. In 1537, within the sacred precincts of the court at Hampton Court Palace, he was accused of sympathizing with the Catholic rebels of the Pilgrimage of Grace. A courtier named Edward Seymour, not the future protector but a relative, challenged him. Surrey didn't debate him. He tried to punch him. To strike a blow within the king's court was a capital offense. It was considered striking the king himself. Surrey was arrested. He was saved from severe punishment only by his father's influence and his own youth, but he was confined to Windsor Castle, a cruel punishment, forcing him to live among the ghosts of his lost friend. This pattern repeated itself. Surrey seemed incapable of controlling his impulses. He felt that his noble blood placed him above the petty laws that governed lesser men. The most bizarre incident occurred in 1543, the infamous window-smashing rampage. It is a scene that resembles the reckless antics of unruly youth rather than the conduct of a high-born peer. Surrey, along with the son of Sir Thomas Wyatt and other young rakes, went on a drunken tear through London. They didn't just smash windows, they fired stone bows at the citizens. When dragged before the Privy Council, Surrey's defense was a masterpiece of twisted arrogance. He claimed he did it to awaken the Londoners to their sins. He cast himself as a biblical prophet with a slingshot, punishing the wicked city. The council was not impressed. They sent him to Fleet Prison. It is hard to reconcile this hooligan with the man who wrote, "The sooty season, that bud and bloom forth brings, with green hath clad the hill and eke the vale." But perhaps they were connected. Surrey was a man of intense, uncontainable energy. When channeled into ink, it created art. When channeled into life, it created chaos. He was a man who felt everything too deeply: his pride, his grief, his rage. He lacked the one thing a courtier needed most: a mask. As the 1540s dawned, Henry VIII was aging. The conservative Howards and the reformist Seymours were circling each other, waiting for the old lion to die. Surrey was the champion of the conservatives, the hope of the old nobility. But his enemies were watching him. They were cataloging his outbursts, his arrogance, and his reckless words. They were building a file. And Surrey, in his infinite pride, was giving them all the ammunition they needed. He was about to step onto the battlefield of France, seeking the military glory that he believed was his birthright. But the fields of Boulogne would not bring him glory, they would bring him ruin. Yet the salon and the street brawl were not enough to satisfy the restless spirit of a man who believed himself the descendant of kings. Poetry could soothe his soul, and violence could vent his rage, but neither could offer him the one thing a Tudor nobleman craved above all else: martial glory. As the ink dried on his sonnets and the glass of London's broken windows was swept away, Surrey looked across the English Channel. He saw a theater of war opening up that promised to turn his chaotic energy into legendary heroism, or so he desperately hoped. By 1543, Henry Howard was 26 years old. He was a celebrated poet, a notorious brawler, and a father. But in the eyes of his peers, and more importantly, in his own eyes, he was incomplete. To be a true exemplar of the old nobility, one had to be more than a courtier. One had to be a warlord. The Howard name was forged in iron, not ink. His grandfather had won the Battle of Flodden. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was the realm's premier general, having crushed the Pilgrimage of Grace. Surrey felt the weight of this martial legacy pressing down on him. He needed a war. Fortunately for him, King Henry VIII was in a bellicose mood. The king, now in his 50s and rapidly failing in health, sought to recapture the glory of his youth. He allied himself with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V against their mutual enemy, France. For Surrey, this was salvation. War was the perfect theater for his aggression. It was the one place where his reckless courage, which got him into so much trouble in London, would be considered a virtue. In October 1543, Surrey crossed the Channel, not as a tourist this time, but as a volunteer in the Emperor's army. He joined the imperial forces at the Siege of Landrecy. It was a brief campaign, but it was instructive. Surrey was treated with immense respect by the Emperor Charles V, who praised the young earl's gentle heart and eagerness for battle. Surrey rode with the Emperor's own guard, observing the massive industrial scale of continental warfare. The trenches, the artillery barrages, the complex logistics. He returned to England in November with his reputation burnished. He was no longer just a wild youth. He was a soldier who had ridden with the Caesar of Europe. The summer of 1544 saw the launch of the greatest military enterprise of Henry VIII's reign. The king invaded France with a massive army of 40,000 men. It was a logistical leviathan, a floating city of tents, cannons, and colored silk moving across the Channel. Surrey was appointed Marshal of the Field, a senior command position responsible for the organization and discipline of the army. It was a role that required administrative patience, something Surrey lacked, but it placed him at the nerve center of the invasion. The objective was Boulogne, a fortified port city on the French coast. The siege of Boulogne became the focal point of English national pride. The king himself, despite his ulcerated legs and immense girth, arrived to oversee the siege personally, dressed in magnificent armor that had been specially widened to accommodate his bulk. Surrey was in his element. He commanded the trench warfare, directing the batteries of artillery that pounded the medieval walls of the city. He was fearless, often exposing himself to enemy fire to rally his men. On one occasion, during a skirmish at Montreuil, he was wounded, a badge of honor that he wore with immense pride. On September 13th, 1544, the mines detonated under the castle walls, and Boulogne surrendered. It was a triumph. Henry VIII rode into the conquered city in a spectacle of Roman triumph. For a brief moment, the sun shone on the Tudors and the Howards alike. But victories in France were easy to win and hard to keep. The main army returned to England, leaving a garrison to hold the prize against the inevitable French counterattack. In 1545, the king bestowed upon Surrey the ultimate vote of confidence. He appointed the 28-year-old Earl as Lieutenant General of the King on land and sea for all the continental possessions. Surrey was now the military governor of Boulogne and Calais. He was the viceroy of English France. This was the pinnacle of his career. He was commanding thousands of men, managing a massive budget, and holding the frontier of the realm. At first, he performed brilliantly. He was energetic and aggressive. He led daring raids into the French countryside, burning villages, and seizing supplies to feed his garrison. He strengthened the fortifications, obsessing over the geometry of the new bastions, a subject, like poetry, that appealed to his Renaissance mind. He wrote home to the king and the Privy Council with detailed, confident reports. He felt he had finally found his true calling. He was a prince of the church militant, but the seeds of disaster were already sown. Surrey was a tactician, not a strategist. He loved the adrenaline of the raid, the glory of the charge. He had no patience for the boring, grinding reality of defensive warfare, the rationing of bread, the checking of sentries, the endless waiting. Moreover, his reports to the council became increasingly arrogant. He demanded more money, more men, more supplies, writing with the tone of a man who believed the entire treasury of England existed solely to support his personal glory. Back in London, the new men, led by Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, were reading these letters with narrowing eyes. They controlled the purse strings. They saw Surrey not as a hero, but as a dangerous spendthrift who was risking the king's conquest with his reckless aggression. The turning point of Henry Howard's life, the moment that pivoted him from a hero to a failure, occurred on a freezing Tuesday in January 1546. Surrey received intelligence that a French supply column was moving toward a fort near Saint-Étienne, just a few miles from Boulogne. The column was reported to be carrying food and ammunition for the French army. A cautious commander would have scouted the force, assessed the risks, and perhaps harassed them with skirmishers. Surrey was not a cautious commander. He saw an opportunity for a glorious smash and grab. He wanted to starve the French out and win a pitched battle. He gathered a force of about 2,000 foot soldiers and roughly 600 cavalry. He rode out of the gates of Boulogne, the frosty ground crunching under the hooves of his charger, his heart pounding with the anticipation of victory. But his intelligence was flawed. The French force was significantly larger than reported, and it was commanded by Oudard Dubiez, a seasoned marshal of France. When the two forces met near Saint-Étienne, Surrey made a fatal tactical error. He was commanding the cavalry personally. Overcome by the fury of the moment, he ordered a full charge against the French horsemen. The charge was brilliant. Surrey and his knights smashed into the French cavalry, breaking their lines and driving them back. For a few minutes it looked like a rout. Surrey, sword in hand, was chasing the fleeing Frenchmen, caught up in the fury of the charge. But in his zeal, he had left his infantry, the foot soldiers and archers, far behind and completely unsupported. While Surrey was chasing the cavalry, the main body of the French infantry, disciplined, numerous, and battle-hardened, advanced on the English foot soldiers. The English infantry, Seeing their commander galloping away into the distance and facing a wall of French pikes, panicked. The English line collapsed. It wasn't a retreat, it was a slaughter. The French cut down the English infantry by the hundreds. Surrey, wheeling his horse around, realized too late what had happened. He returned to the field to find his foot soldiers dead or scattering in terror. The victory of the cavalry was meaningless. The battle was lost. The human cost was devastating. But for Surrey, the political cost was lethal. Among the dead were several gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, men of high status who were personal favorites of Henry VIII. Surrey had led the king's friends into a meat grinder. When the news of the defeat at Saint-Étienne reached London, the reaction was electric. King Henry VIII was a man who could forgive cruelty, greed, and lust. He could not forgive failure. He especially could not forgive failure that made him look weak in front of the French king. The defeat was not strategically catastrophic. Boulogne did not fall, but it was a humiliation. The new men at court pounced. Edward Seymour and his faction whispered in the king's ear. "Surrey is reckless," they said. "He is a boy playing at war. He wastes your treasure. He kills your gentlemen. He is too proud to listen to counsel." Henry VIII's response was swift and brutal. In March 1546, a messenger arrived in Boulogne with a royal command. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was relieved of his command. He was ordered to return to England immediately. But the knife was twisted deeper. The letter stated that a new lieutenant general had been appointed to take his place. The man coming to replace him, to take over his office, his quarters, and his army, was none other than Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. It was the ultimate insult. To be fired was one thing. To be replaced by his archenemy, the leader of the new men, the man Surrey despised above all others, was unbearable. Surrey returned to England in a state of blind, incandescent fury. He was humiliated, exhausted, and possibly suffering from what we would now call combat stress. He didn't return to court with his tail between his legs. He returned with a burning desire for revenge. He began to speak openly, loudly, and treasonously. He told anyone who would listen that the Seymours were mean creatures who had poisoned the king's mind. He declared that when the king died, which everyone knew would be soon, the Howards would settle the score. He was digging his own grave with his tongue. The England that Surrey returned to in the spring and summer of 1546 was a terrifying place. The king was dying. The court was no longer about governance, it was a death struggle for the regency. Prince Edward was a child of 9. Whoever controlled the boy when Henry VIII died would be the de facto king of England. The factions were stark. The Seymours, reformers, the prince's uncles, wanted a Protestant England. They knew that if the Howards came to power, the Seymours would likely be executed. The Howards, conservatives, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Surrey, wanted a Catholic England without the Pope and a return to the power of the old nobility. The Seymours needed to destroy the Howards before the king took his last breath. But they needed a pretext. They found it in paint and wood. Surrey, in his obsessive pride, had been altering his coat of arms. He commissioned a painting which still exists that showed his shield. In the first quarter of the shield, he had placed the arms of Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon Saint King. Genealogically, the Howards had a distant right to these arms through the Mowbray line. But in the 16th century, you did not just use royal arms. It was a visual language. By displaying the arms of a king, Surrey was symbolically stating that he was of royal status. The Seymours took this information to the dying king. They spun a narrative that fed directly into Henry's darkest paranoias. Why is Surrey using royal arms? Why is he gathering men? Why does he hate the prince's uncles? "He intends to usurp the throne, your majesty," they whispered. "He believes he has a better claim to England than your son. He plans to murder the prince and take the crown for himself." It was a lie, but it was a plausible lie. Surrey's arrogance made it believable. On December 2nd, 1546, the trap snapped shut. Surrey was at the Duke of Norfolk's London palace when the captain of the guard arrived. He was arrested not for debt or brawling this time, but for high treason. He was marched through the streets of London, the city he had once vandalized, to the Tower of London. As the heavy gates of the Traitor's Gate slammed shut behind him, the poet Earl must have known that the time for sonnets was over. The time for the axe had arrived, but the betrayal was not yet complete. The Seymours needed witnesses to seal his fate, and they would find the most damning witness of all not among his enemies, but in his own blood. With the trap sprung and the heavy doors of the tower locked, the Seymours had their man. But an arrest was not a conviction. To kill a peer of the realm, especially a Howard, required more than just accusations of pride or bad generalship. It required evidence of a rot deep within the soul. The prosecutors knew they could not find this on the battlefield or in the council chamber. To destroy Henry Howard, they would have to invade the sanctity of his home and turn the most intimate bonds of loyalty into weapons of war. While Surrey sat in the damp silence of the Tower of London, staring at the stone walls that had imprisoned his grandfather and cousins before him, the government's machinery was tearing his world apart from the outside. The Seymours and the King's secretary, William Paget, knew that the heraldry charge, the business with the coat of arms, was technically treason, but it was abstract. To ensure the execution of the most powerful nobleman in England, they needed something visceral. They needed proof of a depraved, usurping mind. To find it, they sent agents to Kenninghall, the great ducal palace of the Howards in Norfolk. Their target was not the men of the house, but the women. The Howard family, for all its power, was a nest of vipers. It was a family fractured by abuse, religious differences, and long-simmering resentments. The investigators knew exactly which cracks to pry open. First, they found Bess Holland. She was the mistress of Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk. She had lived with the Duke for years, while the Duke's wife, Surrey's mother, sat in bitter exile. Bess Holland was a survivor. When the King's men threatened her with implication in the treason, she turned on her lover and his son with lightning speed. She testified that the Duke had spoken treasonously, that he hated the new men, and that Surrey was even worse, a man so arrogant he believed he should rule the world. But the blow that truly killed Henry Howard came from his own sister. Mary Howard, the Duchess of Richmond, was the widow of Surrey's beloved friend, Henry Fitzroy. In their youth, Surrey and Mary had been close, but in recent years they had drifted apart. Mary had become a devout evangelical Protestant, aligning herself spiritually with the very new men her brother despised. Surrey, clinging to the old ways and his own pride, had mocked her piety. When the interrogators brought Mary in, she did not defend her brother. She destroyed him. She told the council that her brother was a man of high and haughty stomach. But then she dropped a bombshell that silenced the room. She recounted a conversation, perhaps a joke, perhaps a dark suggestion that Surrey had once made to her. She claimed that Surrey had told her that she should use her beauty and her proximity to the king to advance the family's interests. He had allegedly suggested that she should play the role of Madame d'Etampes. Madame d'Etampes was the official mistress of the French King Francis I, a woman who wielded immense political power. The implication was horrific. Mary was claiming that her brother, the premier nobleman of England, had tried to pimp out his own sister to the king, to urge her to become a royal whore, solely so the Howards could rule England through her influence. Whether Surrey actually meant this, or whether it was a sarcastic barb thrown during a family argument, you might as well be his mistress for all the good you do. We will never know. But in the hands of the prosecutors, it was dynamite. It painted Surrey not just as a traitor, but as a moral monster, a Machiavellian schemer willing to prostitute his own blood for power. With this testimony, the net closed. The poet Earl was now the pimp Earl in the eyes of the law. The trial of Henry Howard took place at the Guildhall in London. It was the theatrical event of the season. The great hall was packed with spectators, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and anticipation. Surrey was brought to the bar dressed not in the rags of a prisoner, but in a suit of rich silk that defied his captors. He looked pale from his month in the Tower, but his eyes were burning with a fierce manic energy. He knew he was walking into a show trial. The verdict had likely been decided before he even stepped off the barge, but he was determined to go down fighting. The jury was a mockery of justice. It was packed with men from the Norfolk region who feared the crown, and worse, it included several of the new men Surrey had spent his life insulting. The indictment was read. It was a long, rambling list of charges centered on the quartering of the royal arms of Edward the Confessor. The prosecutor argued that by using these arms, Surrey was claiming the throne and threatening the prince's inheritance. Surrey's defense was not the pleading of a victim, it was the roaring of a lion. He dismantled the heraldry charge with contemptuous ease. He pointed out that his ancestors had worn those arms. He produced a herald's ruling from years ago that authorized him to use them. "I have done nothing," he declared, "that my fathers did not do before me." When a witness, a courtier named Sir Richard Southwell, stood up to give evidence about Surrey's threatening language, Surrey didn't cross-examine him legally. He offered to fight him. "If the law will allow it," Surrey shouted, "I will prove him a liar in his teeth by my sword." He was offering a trial by combat, a medieval solution to a legal problem. It was a moment of pure anachronism. Here was the last medieval knight standing in a Renaissance courtroom, offering to duel his way out of a treason charge. The court stared at him in disbelief. The request was denied. Then came the moment that defined his character forever. Another witness, a low-born man who had risen high in the administration, took the stand to recount Surrey. Surrey looked the man up and down, his lip curling with that famous Howard sneer. He turned to the jury and said, "Loud enough for the rafters to hear, I leave it to you to judge whether it is probable that a man such as I should communicate his secrets to a man so base, so vile, and so unworthy as this?" It was the ultimate expression of his fatal flaw. Even facing death, he could not hide his snobbery. He was essentially telling the jury, "I am too good to have talked to this peasant." It was brilliant rhetoric, but it was suicidal legal strategy. He insulted the very class of men who sat on the jury. He confirmed exactly what the prosecution was saying, that he was an arrogant megalomaniac who thought he was above the rest of humanity. The trial lasted all day. Surrey fought every point, matching the lawyers, wit for wit. He was brilliant, articulate, and utterly doomed. At the end of the day, the jury retired. They did not need long. They returned with the only verdict that would satisfy the dying king: guilty. Surrey was sentenced to the traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was later commuted by the king's mercy to beheading, a privilege reserved for the nobility. As he was led away, the axe edge turned toward him. Surrey did not weep. He held his head high, walking out of the Guildhall and back into history. 6 days later, the scene returned to Tower Hill, where our story began. The winter of 1547 was one of the coldest on record. The Thames was freezing over. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Surrey spent his final days in prayer. For all his Renaissance humanism, at the end, he returned to the faith of his childhood. He wrote paraphrases of the Psalms, seeking comfort in the ancient words of King David. When he mounted the scaffold, he was 30 years old. He had lived a life that would take most men a century to consume. He had been a prince's brother, a lover, a father, a warrior, a vandal, a prisoner, and a poet. He spoke briefly to the crowd. He admitted he was a sinner, but he maintained to the last that he was no traitor. He forgave the executioner. He took off his furred gown, revealing the shirt that would soon be stained red. He knelt. He prayed, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. The axe fell. The head of the Earl of Surrey, the most brilliant mind of his generation, rolled into the straw. The executioner lifted it up, shouting, "Behold the head of a traitor!" But the crowd was silent. They knew they had not seen justice done. They had seen a political murder. The tragedy of Surrey's death is compounded by the timing. It was a race against the clock, and Surrey lost by a matter of days. While Surrey's body was being carted away to the church of All Hallows Barking, King Henry VIII was slipping into a coma at Whitehall Palace. The king was so terrified of death that he had made it treason to predict the time of his demise. No doctor dared tell him the end was near. Finally, on the night of January 27th, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned. The king could no longer speak. He could only squeeze the archbishop's hand. In the early hours of January 28th, 1547, just 9 days after Surrey was beheaded, King Henry VIII died. The irony was staggering. Surrey's father, the Duke of Norfolk, was still in the Tower. His execution was scheduled for the morning of the 28th. The warrant had been drawn up, but the king died during the night. In the chaos of the transition, with the Seymours scrambling to secure control of the boy king, Edward VI, they decided not to proceed with Norfolk's execution. It would have been too bloody a start to a new reign. So the father lived. The Duke of Norfolk remained a prisoner in the Tower for the entire 6-year reign of Edward VI, only to be released when Catholic Queen Mary I took the throne in 1553. He lived to be an old man, reclaiming his titles and lands, but the son, the brilliant, foolish, beautiful son, was gone. Surrey had been sacrificed to clear the path for the Seymours. He was the burnt offering that allowed the new regime to rise. For years, Henry Howard lay in a modest grave at All Hallows Barking, near the execution site. The man who had built the first classical mansion in England, who had worn velvet and silk, lay rotting in the dark earth of a city churchyard. It seemed that his enemies had won. The Seymours became the rulers of England. Edward Seymour became the Lord Protector, the uncrowned king. The Howards were smashed. But history plays a long game. The Seymours would fall. Edward Seymour would be beheaded on the same hill as Surrey just a few years later. The young King Edward VI would die at age 15, and the Howards would rise again. Surrey's son, Thomas Howard, would become the 4th Duke of Norfolk. His second son, Henry Howard, would become the Earl of Northampton. In 1614, almost 70 years after the axe fell, Surrey's son Henry finally brought his father home. He moved the body to the Church of St. Michael the Archangel in Framlingham, Suffolk. There, he built a tomb that rivals the monuments of kings. It is a spectacular structure of painted alabaster. Surrey lies there, carved in stone, dressed in his parliamentary robes, his coronet on his head. Beside him lies his wife, Frances. But the most telling detail of the tomb is not the statues. It is the inscription. It does not mention his execution. It does not mention the treason. It simply lists his titles and his lineage. It is a final silent act of defiance. It says, "The king could take his head, but he could not take his dignity. The stone of the tomb sealed away the man, but it could not contain his spirit." While the politicians and executioners believed they had silenced the foolish Earl forever, they had failed to realize that Henry Howard had left something behind that was immune to the axe. The flesh had failed, the dynastic ambitions had crumbled, but in the quiet corners of libraries and the hushed scribblings of future poets, a different kind of immortality was beginning to take root. While the body of Henry Howard lay in a cold grave at All Hallows Barking, a different part of him refused to die. Throughout his short, violent life, Surrey had been building a monument. It wasn't made of marble or bronze, but of paper and ink, and unlike his castles or his titles, this monument would prove to be indestructible. To understand the sheer magnitude of what Henry Howard achieved, we have to understand the state of the English language before he touched it. In the early 1500s, English was considered a barbarous tongue by the rest of Europe. It was seen as clunky, guttural, and unrefined, good for shouting orders at a dog or buying turnips at a market, but useless for high art. The gold standard for poetry was Italian, the language of Petrarch, or French. English poetry was still largely stuck in the medieval rhythms of Chaucer. While Chaucer was a genius, his Middle English meter was difficult for Tudor ears to tune into. It felt archaic, stumbling, and heavy. Surrey changed this. He didn't just write poems, he re-engineered the English language. He was a mechanic of sound. He took the engine of English apart and put it back together so it could hum with the elegance of Italian. His first great breakthrough was the sonnet. The sonnet form had been perfected in Italy by Petrarch. It was a strict 14-line structure. But the Italian language is overflowing with easy rhymes, words ending in vowels like o, I. English is a language hard, Germanic endings. Trying to force English words into the strict Italian rhyme scheme was torture. Surrey saw the problem. He realized that for the sonnet to work in English, the structure needed to be looser, more flexible. He reinvented the rhyme scheme. He divided the 14 lines into 3 quatrains, 4-line stanzas, followed by a punchy 2-line couplet at the end. The formula was A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G. If you look at that formula and think that that's a Shakespearean sonnet, you are correct. But Shakespeare didn't invent it. He stole it. He took the tool that Henry Howard forged and used it to build his empire. Every single sonnet Shakespeare wrote, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" rest on the architectural blueprint drawn by the Earl of Surrey. Surrey's sonnets were not just technical exercises. They were emotionally raw. He wrote about the pain of love, the cruelty of rejection, and the fickleness of fortune. He created a literary persona, the lonely lover, that would dominate Elizabethan poetry. When he wrote about his fair Geraldine, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, he wasn't just flirting, he was creating the first modern English love lyrics. If the sonnet was his gift to lovers, blank verse was his gift to heroes. Surrey undertook a massive project, translating Virgil's Aeneid from Latin into English. He faced a dilemma. Latin epic poetry doesn't rhyme. It relies on a rolling, majestic meter. How could he replicate that dignity in English without the jingle-jangle of nursery rhymes? His solution was a stroke of genius. He used a specific meter called iambic pentameter, 10 syllables, alternating unstressed and stressed, de-dum, da-dum, 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 de-dum. But, and this was the revolution, he decided not to rhyme the ends of the lines. He called it strange meter. We call it blank verse. It is impossible to overstate how important this was. Blank verse turned out to be the natural frequency of the English language. It mimics the rhythm of the human heart and natural speech, but elevates it. Because of Surrey, Christopher Marlowe could write Dr. Faustus. Because of Surrey, Shakespeare could write the soliloquies of Hamlet and Macbeth. Because of Surrey, John Milton could write Paradise Lost. They are all walking on the road Henry Howard paved. He liberated English poetry from the tyranny of rhyme, allowing it to breathe, to shout, and to whisper. For centuries, historians have argued over the corpse of Henry Howard. Was he a misunderstood genius murdered by a tyrant? Or was he a dangerous, arrogant fool who practically begged for the axe? Critics of Surrey argue that he was the architect of his own destruction. They point to his undeniable instability. This was a man who punched courtiers in the face, smashed windows in a drunken rage, and openly threatened to deal with the king's ministers once the king was dead. In the fragile atmosphere of 1547, with a 9-year-old boy about to inherit the throne, a man like Surrey was a liability. He represented the threat of civil war. He was a feudal warlord in a modernizing state. If the Seymours hadn't killed him, he likely would have tried to overthrow them. His heraldry stunt, displaying the royal arms, was not just an artistic choice, it was a political manifesto. He was screaming, "I am royal," in a crowded room full of nervous people. However, the evidence for actual treason is non-existent. The heralds had approved his use of the Edward the Confessor arms. Using them might have been arrogant, but it wasn't illegal. There was zero physical evidence of a plot, no stockpiles of weapons, no letters to foreign princes, no secret meetings. The evidence against him came from a spurned mistress and a sister who had been pressured by the government. It was a kangaroo court. The truth likely lies in the middle. Surrey was not a traitor in the sense that he was actively planning to murder the king, but he was constructively treasonous. He was a man who refused to accept the reality of his time. He was an analog man in a digital world. He refused to bend to the new men, so they broke him. The most fascinating aspect of Henry Howard is the chasm between his life and his art. How could the same man be a drunken hooligan and a sensitive poet? In the streets of London, he was a vandal. In the council chamber, he was a bully, entitled and cruel to those he deemed inferior. Yet, in his study, he was vulnerable. His poetry is filled with a profound sense of loss, melancholy, and the appreciation of fleeting beauty. Perhaps the answer is that he felt everything too intensely. He lacked the emotional skin that protects most people. When he was angry, he raged. When he was sad, he wept in verse. He was a man of high stomach, as his sister said, driven by passions he could not control. His life is a tragedy of wasted potential. He had the birth, the brains, and the bravery to be England's greatest leader. If he had possessed just an ounce of humility, just a grain of political caution, he could have ruled the Regency Council for Edward VI. He could have shaped the future of the nation. Instead, he burned himself out. He was Icarus, flying on wings of wax, poetry, and feathers, pride, soaring too close to the sun of the Tudor crown. On a quiet winter day, if you visit the tomb of Henry Howard in Framlingham Church, you are struck by the peace of the place. The alabaster effigy lies still, hands clasped in prayer, far removed from the blood and mud of Boulogne or the stench of the Tower. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, is often treated as a footnote in history books, the last name on the long list of Henry VIII's victims. But he is so much more than a statistic. He is the bridge between the medieval and the modern. He stood with one foot in the world of knights, castles, and feudal honor, and the other foot in the world of the Renaissance, with its humanism, its poetry, and its focus on the individual soul. The tragedy of his life is that the world was moving too fast for him. The medieval world he loved was dying, dismantled by the new men and their bureaucracy. He tried to fight the tide with a sword and he lost, but with a pen he won. The Seymours took his head, they took his life, they took his power, but they could not kill his voice. Every time an actor steps onto a stage and speaks the immortal lines of Hamlet, every time a poet pens a sonnet to a lost love, the ghost of Henry Howard stands in the wings, smiling. He was the reckless, arrogant, brilliant boy who taught the English language how to sing.